On this episode of AE Live, we're talking to a member of Associated's Strategic Advisory Services Group to get his take on the importance of helping clients make informed decisions, address financial considerations, and manage risk and uncertainty in our rapidly evolving world.
Coming up to you on the internet, audio, on my stem, homies know AE's where you gotta go, shuffle to the rhythm of the Grandma Michael groove. It's a whole new Pure Plur interview. Treat your ears to the gist of careers from the list of our engineers and scientists, maybe twisted up with technologists. It's a podcast, baby, and not to be missed. Got more fly than a ripe banana, like the salmon caught the stamina streaming across Canada. Like a trade show cabana, got that swiggity swag and the 411 for my horse Niagara. AE Live, don't you know we're gonna innovate? AE Live, got a topic here to elevate. AE Live, here to entertain and educate. AE Live, oh! AE Live, don't you know we're gonna innovate? AE Live, got a topic here to elevate. AE Live, we're gonna entertain and educate. AE Live, oh!
This podcast was recorded in Vancouver on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Released in 2023, Indigenous Services Canada's Closing the Infrastructure Gap by 2030 report provides a detailed analysis of the costs required to provide needed infrastructure to First Nations in Canada. The document, prepared jointly by a team led by the Assembly of First Nations and Indigenous Services Canada, includes the participation of 401 First Nations communities across the country and highlights the impacts and costs of decades of underfunding. As one example, the report notes that high-speed internet has been available to most Canadians since the early 2000s, but that as of publication, 466 First Nations communities are still without reliable high-speed internet. 118 have no reliable access to the internet at all. So many services that we all often rely on, such as virtual meetings, schooling, shopping, health consultations, and more, are simply unavailable. The core conclusion of the report is that Canada needs $349.2 billion in spending to support First Nations communities and minimize the disparities between First Nations and Canadians in their access to essential community infrastructure. And, while the dollar figure represents significant funding commitments made by the federal government, it also includes sustainability and climate resilience goals. Joining me to talk more about closing the infrastructure gap, his experience working with First Nations, and his commitment to working on climate change adaptation and mitigation is Craig MacDonald. Craig is an engineer in Associated Engineering Strategic Advisory Services Group and has extensive skills around emerging transportation technologies, in addition to his experience in climate and infrastructure policy, asset management, and transportation planning. Craig, thanks for joining me today. Welcome to the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
You have a bachelor's in civil engineering and a master's degree in integrated infrastructure systems from the University of Calgary.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about your education and what kind of led you down that path.
Yeah, for sure. So I think my background is just a little bit out of the usual for what we have here. I think I was actually pretty on the fence about whether I really felt like an engineer for at least the very early part of my schooling, up until basically I started my master's. So during the course of that time, I did, I think in my first summer, I did research on winter disasters in Alberta with a professor I met at the university there. The following summer, I worked with the city of Calgary. I worked with their water business continuity and emergency management group there. So I looked at emergency water restriction guidelines, as well as a bunch of emergency response plans and planning processes. So say like a pump station goes, we would do simulations, more or less, like emergency activation drills and things like that. Following summer after that, I worked on the Green Line team, doing a mixture of transportation planning and actual project management work. So following that, I kind of took a swing for the fences, and I heard about an opportunity from a friend to do a research contract in Sri Lanka. And as part of that contract, I'd be looking at whether the government of Sri Lanka, their National Disaster Management Agency, had implemented an emergency response system called Incident Command System. So Incident Command System is a well-known and well-practiced emergency response system. It was developed to respond to wildfires. It's used in the US, in Canada, down in Australia as well too. And I learned and kind of gone through some of those processes while I was working with the city of Calgary. So it seemed like an interesting opportunity to do some research there. So I moved to Sri Lanka for a little while. I spent 4 months kind of working with their National Disaster Management Agency, having interviews, going through their processes and records, and seeing how well they implemented it. Spoilers, they didn't really implement it very well, but sometimes worth figuring that one out and then recommending some potential improvements there. And following that, I ended up moving to India for another half year after that as well too, where I worked just outside of Delhi doing some planning and design work on decentralized water and wastewater treatment, or just wastewater treatment systems.
Right. What you've talked a bit about it, but what was that experience, kind of living in Sri Lanka and then India, and seeing a very different part of the world as a young engineer there? It
was good, challenging in a lot of ways. There's always the difficulties of like living in a new place and getting used to kind of all the roughness around the edges in some parts of the world. But honestly, I thought it was a really good experience to see how people are doing things on the ground in a completely different circumstance than what you're used to. But also how much some things tend to actually stay the same. So, for instance, when I would interview a lot of these officials in different parts of government, and they're usually senior officials, they're usually really well-educated, passionate people who have been in the game for a long time. So these would be like people working in municipal or federal bureaucracies with like PhD level educations. They've studied abroad somewhere and come back, and they're really passionate about what they do. And they would kind of take this as an opportunity to go on a really nice, informative rant about what they think is wrong with, their department or why things don't work according to plan. And they frame this as if it's this very like, specifically Sri Lankan issue. That this is why things are like this, why we can't get anything done. So in a lot of ways, it was really interesting to see the similarities there.
Okay, so you spent about a year overseas, and then you kind of returned and. Looks like a bit more work experience, and then back to school.
Yeah, so I came back. I was looking around at work as well too. Nothing really seemed like kind of the right fit. Again, that kind of on the edges of civil engineering. There was just like no perfect opportunity there. And I ended up bumping into an old professor that I met during a conference on, I think, seismic risk, and she encouraged me to go back and do my master's. She had just started up this new program. It was called Integrated Infrastructure for Sustainable Cities. She'd just gotten the funding for it. It was intended to be this really interdisciplinary approach to systems thinking about different kinds of infrastructure, really trying to map out the linkages between them and understand the system dynamics there. So she gave me the pitch and asked me if I'd be the guinea pig for this program. So I was the first student in that program. And I thought it was fantastic. It was great. I really had a lot of leeway to choose the kind of research I was interested in. So I really honed in on the risk side of things as well. And then I ended up writing my thesis. It was on the impacts of electric vehicles on mass evacuations. So particularly evacuations from wildfires. This is actually tied in kind of well with some of my life experience as well too. My mom's from up in mid-central BC. And while I was up there was a massive wildfire that was just like right on the edges of town. The family business was on the edge of burning down basically for like 2 weeks straight. Right. It was just, 50 kilometers away. It's 1 or 2 hours, bad wind. The fire was barely under control. At the end of it, we just had to basically pack up everything we owned, or almost everything we owned. I drove back to Calgary in a big cloud of smoke, and it was really lousy. It was a good chance to kind of, maybe merge some of the life experiences with a little bit of the academic research behind how do evacuations work. Sure. What are some of the dynamics behind them? And then how can we kind of make this process better? And then introducing kind of that curveball of like emerging technologies, like with electric vehicles. Mm-hmm. You have vehicles which take much longer to fill up. Right. Let's say you get the evacuation notice, you need to be out of town within like an hour or two. If everyone needs to charge up their electric vehicles, or if you're on part of a tank, and then you have to drive longer distances and there's recharging stations along the way, what does that look like for both departure times, but then also for, let's say, breakdowns along the side of the road, and what that does to traffic dynamics? So, interesting topic.
That is an interesting topic. Yeah. I think a lot of thoughts that probably most people aren't considering as we watch that shift from internal combustion to electric and hybrid vehicles.
Yeah, and none of it was anything that couldn't be overcome, but it's just like one extra level of planning, which I don't think a lot of people would consider at the time. Around midway through, I actually took a quick 1-year break from the master's as well too. So I did my coursework, and then I moved to Ottawa and I worked for the feds for a little bit with Infrastructure Canada. So I worked on their climate resilient infrastructure team there. So while I was there, I worked on revising some of the climate lens guidance. I worked on the second intake of the DMAF program as well too. So that's the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund. So that gave me a pretty interesting behind the scenes looks at both what federal priorities are from like a very high level perspective, and also like when they get the application, like what are they looking for? And kind of just as importantly, who are the people who are looking at it as well too? A lot of people don't come from a really, let's say, an engineering background as well too, or have a lot of familiarity with the underlying subject matter sometimes. So it was a good view behind the scenes of like what kinds of things stand out to these folks as well too, and what helps you submit a really good application. And that's been really helpful coming over on the client side, working with our, let's say, municipal partners as well too, to go and prepare these applications. I finished my thesis in April 2020. I bumped into Dean Shishkowski at a conference while I was presenting some of my work on my thesis. And yeah, one thing led to another, and I ended up working with AE ever since. And that was maybe just over four and a bit years ago.
Right. So you joined Associated in 2020. Mid-pandemic, I guess, or the beginning of that. You've done a lot of work in asset management with the company, and have since transitioned into, I guess, a bit more of a climate change oriented role in the Strategic Advisory Services Group.
Yep.
Tell me a bit, I guess, about what Strategic Advisory Services is doing, and kind of how that evolution of your role got you there.
Yeah, definitely. So I feel like I really lucked out with getting in touch with the advisory services folks. For the first time, I'm like, oh, this is where I fit. This kind of engineering at the edges kind of approach to things. So this was a really fantastic opportunity for me, and it's lived up to the hype, I guess, on my end as well too. And it's really interesting to be able to do both the strategic planning work and kind of some of that big picture work, but also because we're a core engineering company as well too, we have the skills and expertise to draw on that you can get down into the weeds a little more than I think a lot of other firms can. And that's like a real value proposition. And I'm really happy that we managed to try and strike that balance on a lot of our projects too. Because you can do all the strategic planning you want. If it's removed from day-to-day operations or the reality of the systems that you're working within, it just doesn't do anything. So it's really nice to work with our advisory services team, because we work so closely with all the core engineering disciplines as well to make sure that the recommendations in the planning and just the planning itself is really feasible and implementable. So as part of what we do with advisory services, we do a lot of asset management work. Owen James has run a lot of that as well too, with a lot of input from other folks, Ryan Woodhouse, Graham Lang, and others, like many, many others across the company. And more recently, we've started doing a lot of climate work as well too, particularly in climate risk, though a little bit in climate mitigation as well too, so emissions buying. So on top of those two things, we also do a lot of other work, supporting work around environmental. So whether that's with solid waste management, whether that's with looking at, let's say, fugitive emissions at water and wastewater treatment plants. We do a lot of transportation work. If anyone wants to hear more about that, Judy was on the last podcast. She has tons and tons and tons of thoughts on potential emerging transportation issues.
Right, yes.
So we do a lot of that as well. And then, there's the odd curveball projects as well too, where we're brought in to, let's say, facilitate a discussion or do community engagement or integrate some core design work into higher level strategic planning.
Right, okay. That's a lot of different areas to cover.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in the work you've done, and we're going to get into some of the projects, obviously. But maybe just before we leave the topic of your education and your own search for the right path, you ended up in a part of Associated that, as you said, is kind of at the edges of engineering and what you thought civil engineering had to be when you were getting your education. Mm-hmm. If you're speaking to a student out there who's not sure of their path, how did you find your way? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. don't know if there's a clear path out of me. I feel like at no point in my life have I ever been able to sit down and say, in 10 years, I am going to be here. But I think my philosophy has always just been to make the best decision you can in the present with the information that you have. And that applies both to like our strategic plan work, but also the way you structure your life too. And I think there's going to be a lot of people out there who get the advice, sit down, think about where you want to be in 10 years and then go for it. And that's going to be really helpful. If you want to be in hydrology, let's say, then I think, and you love it, it's great. You can see yourself doing this for the next 10, 20, 30 years in your career, then absolutely sit down, do that planning and figure out the best way to get there. But I think if that advice doesn't really seem to resonate with you as much, it's also okay to just kind of take things as they go, look for opportunities, and then take those opportunities kind of boldly. But I think you also have to be pretty intentional about making opportunities sometimes. So putting yourself out in positions where you have chances to meet people, where things are happening, where there seems to be a lot of energy and dynamism. And I found that's been good advice earlier on in my career. I also find it's been good advice since I've been in AE as well too. I've been lucky to be in a team that's really growing and evolving quite quickly. And it's kind of given me the freedom and opportunity to go in, kind of carve out a space for myself. I know what my interests are. I know what kind of projects I want to pursue. And I've been lucky enough to have some of the freedom and flexibility to go and pursue that and kind of shape my career.
Right. It sounds like you've been given some interesting opportunities and then just said yes at the right time, really.
Pretty much, yeah.
To try something new. Yep. All right. Well, that's great. Thank you for that. Tell me a bit about some of the more meaningful projects that you've been able to be involved in.
Totally. So I've been lucky to have done a lot of really interesting work over the last couple of years. Some of the big kind of flagship projects we've worked on as part of advisory services at the Calgary office have been, we did a national asset review with the Assembly of First Nations back in 2022. So as part of that, we were trying to identify what the infrastructure gap is across all First Nations, across all of Canada. So we basically looked at the assets for over 600 First Nations, again, from coast to coast to coast, and tried to identify and cost out, okay, you have this many kilometers of road, you have this many commercial institutional buildings, this many water and wastewater treatment plants. How are we going to both start to cost those out, figure out what the value is of those assets, and then also figure out whether whether they're meeting the needs of the community or not. So that was a really interesting project because you're working with some pretty difficult data challenges as well too. You're kind of limited in what you have, but your scope is quite broad and quite high, but you need to come down to like an actual reasonable, practical number at the end of the day, something that you can start to make decisions, start to plan off of. So I think this was a really interesting one because it integrated both asset management and climate considerations. On the asset management side, it's not just creating an asset inventory, but it's also starting to come up with levels of service measures or having to do a lot of legwork to come up with a real feasible and actionable set of assumptions as well too. There was also a really big climate component in this as well too. We looked at climate risk and the exposure to different climate hazards across the entire country as well. And so that involved pulling climate data for over 600 different sites across a huge range of geography. And then trying to do the analysis on that and then coming up with core takeaways. So whether that's coming up with hazard risk mapping and heat mapping, or whether that's boiling that down into what are some general recommendations that First Nations can use to take away from this. And this is really just kind of the starting point there. Big impetus of this work was to go to the feds afterwards as well to present the infrastructure gap and then say, okay, this is what we think it would take to bring First Nations up to the standard of other communities in Canada. It would be this many $1 billion in water infrastructure or wastewater infrastructure, whatever it might be. So it was just a really interesting project from start to finish. We had a really good working relationship with the Assembly of First Nations, and we won an award with Consulting Engineers of Alberta for that work as well. Right.
And it sounds like a huge job. There's obviously the very technical aspects of going over the asset management and the climate change components of it that you mentioned. But I guess for you, and I'm kind of curious how it felt to be working on with the First Nations on such a big project. identifying a gap that was billions of dollars worth of infrastructure in the context of our society, which is increasingly aware of the need for reconciliation, and that report being not too many years before your work started on this.
Yeah.
Give me some thoughts there, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So I found the Assembly of First Nations very interesting to work with as well too, because they kind of do have this really wide perspective, not just of what does this specific community need or this specific community, but they're really interested in identifying what across the board are some of the big major gaps here, and how they can work with the feds and with ISK, with other partners as well too, to start to address some of those gaps. And I think a big impetus for this is just kind of building up to that starting point of what do we know and what do we not know? Where are some of our gaps in information, and how do we start to rectify that so that we can actually move ahead? Because a lot of the times it's really hard to go and approach, say, your federal partners unless you have some numbers in the back of your head. They'll say, can you point to anything concrete about what the infrastructure gap is? Like, we all know there's tons of work to be done to bring water, wastewater, stormwater, whatever kind of infrastructure it is, like up to standard. We all kind of know that. That's what we hear from our partners. That's what we hear from the First Nations that we work with. But it's very hard to then go to the feds and then translate that into action. Because, for better or worse, they have their processes they need to work through too. And part of that is like they need something to put down on paper. They have a hard time coming up with these numbers as well too. So really, I think there's a lot of value to be done in just doing this upfront work to kind of bridge some of these gaps and at least come up with like a starting point, starting estimates for what some of these things are. And then you can negotiate back and forth, but it gives people kind of a level playing field to come together and start to work on addressing this problem. I think working like so closely with the Assembly of First Nations was very important on this kind of project as well too, because you can't just walk in, slap down a number, and then say that's what it is. Go and take it to the feds and say what it is. We had to work in ground truth a lot of these assumptions as well too, especially because a lot of them are with First Nations that we haven't worked with as much in, let's say, like Eastern Canada or far up north, right. Rather than our more local ones as well. So there's everything from assumptions about different kinds of water and water treatment plants, power needs up north, so power generation, or even just like critical ones about when determining, let's say, level of service for different communities as well too. You need to have a good idea of how population projections are going to change over time. So working with them to understand kind of some of the issues around the census and census data and undercounting in a lot of communities as well too, and doing a little bit to revise that upwards so you come up with actual, reasonable numbers. Yeah. Right.
A massive project, obviously, and it takes you, like as you said, across Canada when you're really talking about area of interest. That's not the only work you've done with First Nations groups. Could you have some other projects, maybe a bit smaller scale, that you've worked on? And
totally.
Tell me a bit about those.
One project that I think I'm really proud of over the last year and a half has been our work with the Siksika Nation Housing Department. So we started this work back in December of last year. And as part of this, they had recently done like home inspections of about 220 elders' homes that they had on the nation. And a lot of them need like a pretty substantial amount of work. So you would get basically like 200 like PDF home inspection reports, like you would get like anytime you go out and try and get a mortgage or something like that. And they're filled with recommendations. You need to fix the window here. You need to inspect the furnace. You need to fix the plumbing, like whatever it might be. And our job there was to kind of help them work through that and pull all the information from these reports, catalog it all, tag it to different homes, and then cost all that work out too, so that then we could take it to tender and actually start to get this work done. So kind of like with the Assembly of First Nations work, it's really like we have a lot of information, but it's really hard to kind of pull that together into like an actionable, like first estimate of what the actual cost to complete that work would be. And it's really hard to get a project moving if you don't have at least like some starting point there to go out to contractors with. So we worked with them over the first half of the year to do all of this work, to cost out all this work, mass amount of legwork just to pull it all together, and then to cost out thousands and thousands of recommendations for these 200 plus homes. But that work landed really well. We delivered well on time, on budget. We had a really good relationship with the housing department, and that's led into more work and more work and more work and more work, as it tends to be.
Sure. Yeah.
Following that, we developed a capital maintenance strategy. So expanding that out from the 200 plus elders homes out to the 1,200 plus homes. So all homes on the nation there, to say, what if we want to repair all these homes and bring them up to a reasonable standard? What would that take? And then how would we kind of stage that work as well too? So we completed that work. Work leads into work. So we completed a housing framework for them as well too, to kind of pull together all the different programs that the housing department was using kind of under one document that then they could refer to for when they're either onboarding or when people in the department are trying to understand or get line of sight kind of across the different work that they're doing. And we've since been involved in a lot of training work as well too. We've developed tools to help them cost out work for, let's say, to come up with a scope of work for a contractor if they needed to replace a deck on a home or something like that, and come up with a reasonable cost there. And so we worked really closely with the housing, both management and ops staff as well too, to make sure that these kinds of tools are really useful for them, and that there's something that you can actually incorporate into your work as well too. And all of that work has gone really well. They went to council, they made the ask, and then the first phase of work to repair the elders' homes, they have $6 or $7 million to do that. So we're the owner's engineer on that project right now. We're working with contractor Westcourt to go and complete the repairs on that first stage of homes. And then we'll see what the future brings. But it's actually really satisfying, gratifying work to actually do planning work that then leads into like real repairs. We're actually out there just fixing homes now.
Yeah, it sounds rewarding to kind of see that project. And as you said, from, you're doing work, but it's leading to more, but now you're getting to see kind of the results of your early efforts. I'm assuming you're building some interesting relationships with people in the community as well.
Definitely.
Anything that stands out there?
I would say most of our relationships at the moment are within the housing department themselves. And it's been a good chance to chat with both like management staff, seeing their concerns, and then the operations staff who are on the ground doing the work on a day-to-day. And often right now, you're so caught up in the reactive work. Someone gives you a phone call, my furnace is turned off or something like that. You need to drop out right now. Or, can you fix the plumbing? It's been off for 2 days. Drive out right now. Right. But there's very little time to do that. That planning for the longer-term capital maintenance. Sure. So you can better maintain things. So you spend less time in reactive mode. So a lot of it is being kind of working with our operations staff, the housing department's operations staff, and really kind of understanding like what the pain points are and what they would need to clear up some time so they can go and be more involved in that like forward planning as well too. Is that relationship building component of the job something that you expected going through school and getting your civil engineering degree? No, definitely not to the extent that I thought it would be. Like people will tell you networking is very important. That's very true. People will tell you it's probably pretty important to be able to stand up and present on your work or do a workshop. That's way more important than you think it would be in school. It's all about like having a good relationship and being that trusted advisor with your clients. And I remember that really stuck with me. And, you kind of internalize it a little bit, but over the span of 4 or 5 years, just as you continue working on projects, you work with repeat clients, you understand kind of the value of being in that trusted role and the amount of responsibility that comes with that. I think it's absolutely true. I do think as a company, we do pretty well on actually living up to that value statement as well too. Relationships really matter and they're important for us. It's absolutely a phrase I hear repeated from different people throughout the company. We also talk, I guess, throughout the company, the concept of global perspective, but local focus. Yeah. Given your own work experience and in various places you've been, how does that apply to you and what you bring to the job? It's really emphasized to me how important it is to actually just get things done, like at a local level. Like it is wonderful to keep tabs on the global trends. It's very important to keep up with what other jurisdictions are doing, not just Canadian jurisdictions, jurisdictions in all parts of the world, because there's innovative things happening everywhere. But what's, to me at least, the most important, or what always kind of drives my work, is that all these global takeaways need to be implemented locally. And with a lot of our smaller, even large municipalities as well too, there's so much value in just like doing that hard, frustrating, not particularly glamorous work sometimes of just getting something through like into the implementation phase. So even with like a lot of, let's say, our climate risk work as well too that we do a lot of the upfront risk assessment work. So you identify your priorities. You say, okay, we know that extreme heat is a major concern here. Maybe extreme rainfall is a bit lower down on the list, whatever it might be. But then the goal of that planning needs to be to translate it into actual adaptation planning and real implementation. And so it's not just enough to have like an ordered list of what your risks are. That's fun from like an academic sense. I like doing that work. But until you do the really hard work of sitting down with like operations and management staff in a room and saying like, when do we think we could implement something like this? And what is the cost going to be? And is this something that can go in the next business cycle or the business cycle after that? Like that's where I think a lot of the real value is. And I guess my hope is that we're all just constantly have our eye on the ball.
Sure.
That these plans need to be implemented. And we're kind of in a really good position to do that because, like I was kind of saying earlier, we have both the strategic planning, but then also the operational implementational know-how as well, too, to make these things concrete.
Right. That's a great lead-in. And I'm glad you brought in the climate risk topic, because I know it's an area that you've also done work in addition to the other kind of projects we've been talking about. So we know that climate change and mitigation and adaptation has been an increasingly frequent topic in the news, and we know that we've seen, I guess, the results of significant events from wildfires and flooding have had in the last few years. Tell me a bit about your work in that area and what you see, I guess, coming in the future as needs and for yourself too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess tying in with my background, I've always been interested in risk and uncertainty. It lends itself well to this kind of skill set as well too, like really focused on risk assessment, and then that kind of bigger systems thinking as well too, because often these are large risks that affect a whole of community or have cascading impacts throughout systems. So we do a lot of work with both large and small municipalities and First Nations as well too, to conduct risk assessments, specifically climate risk. And sometimes these are focused on a particular sector or utility. Sometimes they're across an entire municipal organization, and sometimes they're whole of community. And so you're looking at not just what impacts the municipality's ability to, pump water or keep the roads up and running, but also what are impacting groups in your community. So how is this impacting seniors? How is it impacting the business community? How is it impacting the environment around? So it's been a really good chance to work with a really wide range of clients.
So are there, I guess, when it comes to talking about risk and preparing for it, are there things that we as a Canadian society are doing fairly well? And maybe what's the flip side of that? Where do we still need to get better?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like the gears are turning. We're kind of waking up to this slowly but steadily. Like it's a massive problem. It has been for a while, but especially over the last decade or so, the amount of major climate events, which have had both like local and national impacts as well, whether we think of like the atmospheric river that happened just a year or two ago, whether we think of like the Fort Mac fires. Close to home for me, there was the Calgary floods in 2013. Now, what matters is that there's a substantial amount of risk out there, and there's real tangible things we can do to reduce that risk. And I think all orders of government are really kind of stepping up to this, and we start to see this in a lot of ways. There's a lot of funding available now to do adaptation planning. The federal government has just provided more funding through the FCM's Green Municipal Fund as well too, to do adaptation planning and some actual implementation projects. The BC provincial government has just put out another round of funding as well too, through their Community Emergency Preparedness Fund, offering both funding for risk assessments and adaptation plans, but also implementations like construction projects as well too. So it feels like there is both kind of that funding available, and then there's the desire to do it at the local municipal level. We're getting more and more requests from large, medium, small, and First Nations groups as well too, to actually go and start to do some of this planning and then carry it forward into implementation. I think that's really important because risk is only going to go up. We just see more and more extreme events every year. And it's not enough to just not have a plan anymore. You need to have something going. And the earlier you can start thinking about it, the better, because you don't want to wait until after the flood has happened to start doing your emergency preparedness planning.
Right. So obviously you're working with clients on making those plans. That's something we as a company have done for a little while. You also mentioned funding. Are there sources of funding that municipalities aren't necessarily aware of? Does Associated and working with Associated Engineering help our clients find that funding that they might otherwise not be aware of?
I would say definitely. Some people will go into an adaptation plan without any funding available, but especially for smaller municipalities where there's so many competing priorities too, it can be hard to set aside, a certain amount of money and then go and do an adaptation plan. So for a lot of our clients, a lot of the impetus is when this funding becomes available, then it's just a really good opportunity to go out and do it. So we try and keep really good tabs on what funding is available. I mentioned some of the funding, FCM's Green Municipal Fund, and the upcoming funding available in the fall there. The BC government's funding coming up. Last year, there was an excellent round of funding from MCCAC in Alberta as well, too, to do adaptation planning. But even just reaching out to us is, I think, really helpful because we can help kind of connect you and let you know, basically, we have our ear to the ground, what we hear coming up and what might be available. Especially for some of the larger, more complex applications like DMAF applications, so the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund. There's a lot of potential money there, but it's also a lot of potential work to prepare those applications. So we can help with kind of both stages, identifying and applying.
That's probably a great place to leave our conversation. Did you have any kind of final thoughts or topics that we hadn't quite covered yet?
Yeah, totally. I'll give a boring shout out for myself. I have recently become a climate data specialist for the company. So as part of this role, I'll be kind of working across the national practice to help, whether that's project teams or groups, access and use climate data. So it's not just, okay, what's the number here? I'll give you the number and go. It's really just making sure that you understand kind of where it's come from, some of the nuances or considerations about how it's used or how it was sourced, and then how to kind of frame that with clients as well.
Great. Useful.
That's my boring sales pitch for myself. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for including that. All right. Well, thank you for joining me today, Craig. It was an interesting discussion, and I'm glad you could take the time to sit down with me.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
That was Craig MacDonald, a member of Associated's Strategic Advisory Services Group. Craig's work on the Closing the Infrastructure Gap by 2030 report raises some interesting issues. One that stands out to me is this quote: "The changing climate has and will continue to have a major impact on First Nations assets. Flooding, fire, drought, and severe weather collectively present a significant threat to the resilience of First Nations communities. This threat exists now and will increase over time, resulting in an escalating potential for the displacement of citizens and disruption to their lives." While particularly true for Indigenous communities that have been underfunded for many years, the reality is also that our changing climate is having impacts in communities across Canada, and the resulting impacts to municipal assets, and consequently to the disruptions to everyday lives, will be felt by everyone. It was a pleasure to speak with Craig about the work he and Associated's SAS group are doing, and I look forward to seeing the results of their efforts, and those of engineering groups across Canada. Well, that's it for this episode of A Live. Until next time.
Coming to you on the internet audio, on my stem, homies know A's where you gotta go. Shuffle to the rhythm of the Gamma Michael groove. It's a whole new pure plur interview. Treat your ears to the gist of careers from the list of our engineers and scientists, maybe twisted up with technologists. It's a podcast, baby, and not to be missed. Got more fly than a ripe banana, like the salmon caught the stamina streaming across Canada. Like a trade show cabana, got that swoogity swag, and the 411 for my horse Niagara. AE Live, don't you know we're gonna innovate? AE Live, got a topic here to elevate. AE Live, here to entertain and educate. AE Live, oh! AE Live, don't you know we're gonna innovate? AE Live, got a topic here to